Okay, so we're doing Islamic law at the moment, and I am tracing for you the Usul al-Fiqh. Hope this thing works now. I don't know if this is color drawing. This works? Yeah, it works. I hope this is for this board. I don't know. I guess it is. Maybe it'll be there forever. So we're doing the Usul al-Fiqh. I don't like this one. I'm going to get a blue one. This is, see if I can find a blue one in my bag of tricks here. Come. Let's see. I know I got one someplace. Here's one. I like to look at this one. Oh. So first is the Koran. Second are the Hadith. Also, this is Sunni, so they're called the Sunnah. So really, it's the Sunnah is the root, and the Hadith are where you find it. 3 is, since this is Sunnism, Ijma. That's an iron between page 1. And 4 is questionable, but some say Kisa, some say Rai. We'll see what this means in a minute. And this gentleman over here didn't even know, he's not here today yet, that he was from a school of Islamic jurisprudence. Fiqh in Arabic is what we would call jurisprudence in English, but since I never knew what jurisprudence was when I was your age, and you probably don't know, it doesn't help to say jurisprudence, does it? Does anyone know what jurisprudence is? It's not being prudent about anything. It's the theory of law, what you learn in law school, and the theory of the theory and practice of law. So that's what we mean by jurisprudence. So this is the theory of Islamic law. The word is fiqh. The person who practices fiqh is a faqih. It's the same pattern of language that you get is a faqih. Plural, fuqaha. Really weird the way these plurals work. They have patterns of syllables that turn a word into a someone or a plural or something like that. The alim, the person who is supposed to know something, who knows, an alim. The plural of that is ulama. And you might, sometimes it's an E, sometimes it's an A. So you might have heard of that, ulama. See, they get these weird plurals, fuqaha, ulama. The pattern is the same. Alim, faqih, is the same pattern with the vowels in it. So the ulama are the learned ones in an Islamic society. You hear about the Islamic ulama, the learned, the scholars, as it were. But those particularly learned in law are the faqihs, the fuqaha. Then there's another class of people in law, the people who actually have a job in a court. See, these fuqahas, these faqihs are private specialists, like someone who goes to law school but doesn't have a job. Knows the theory of Islamic law, but doesn't have any. If you actually get a job in a court, you're a qadi. You often see the qadis go around with these big headdresses. They have an actual court job. They make decisions in courts. And then finally, people who make opinions about law, like Supreme Court justices and others, people who are considered very learned, a faqih who's very learned, he gives what's called a fatwa, a legal opinion. And the person who gives that, again, it's this pattern of language, is a mufti. Here, F-T, 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 and and this I is the W. He's a mufti. A fatwa is given by a mufti. You've heard, oh, he's a big mufti, but it's just someone who gives a legal opinion, who gives a fatwa. But it's become exalted. He's the mufti, chief legal opinion giver. These are all the people associated with the legal system. So, but everyone starts as a faqih or an alim, a private specialist, a knowledgeable person. All the members make up the ulama, the people who are learned in these matters. And you see now, here Islam resembles what religion? Judaism. There's no other religion like this except Judaism. And you have to say, honestly, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Judaism influenced Islam. All this developed in what we today call Iraq, Mesopotamia mostly. And that's where Jews were particularly vibrant presence. That's where the Talmudic Jewish schools were from the, 200 to 800 period. And right in the time of the formation of Islam in these areas. So if you want to say what's the equivalent of a mufti in Judaism, is a rabbi. Because what's a rabbi? He's really a legal specialist. He's not the head of a community. He only gets to be the head of a community when some community pays him to come and be the head. Otherwise, he's just a rabbi who's been studying the holy law and the holy books. He's a legal specialist. Private legal specialist till he gets a job someplace. And I would say, wouldn't you, maybe 2/3 of rabbis are unemployed. Only about a third are able to get what's called a pulpit these days. Pulpit is some group's going to pen. Most of them are, stockbrokers or something. Street sweepers. Scratch a street sweeper, you find a rabbi. The same in Islam. But you see, it has to be a religion that's based on a holy law, on the law as being the center of the religion. Christianity is not based like that. Therefore, Christianity is not really a Middle Eastern religion. It's a Greek religion. People don't realize that. They see it as a Middle Eastern religion because of the Jesus is placed in a Middle East setting. But the Jesus figure is really a kind of a Dionysus man-god figure, as I've tried to tell you, that Greek God story writers have put in a Palestinian intellectual milieu. You say, oh, he really existed. No, I don't really think he did, honestly. Not the way he's presented. It may have been a character that's based on, but not that portrait. What they've done is take a Hellenized person, stuck him in a Middle East milieu, very cleverly done. And as you see, it's lasted 2,000 years and influenced most of mankind. So it's extremely artful and absolutely, the fact that few people have been able to penetrate it, that's not surprising. And that the believers love it, that's not surprising either. You're supposed to. In Greek culture, the believers loved Apollo and Dionysus for 1,000, 2,000 years. So that's that. In Greek culture, they loved Osiris. And Jesus is a man-god that walks around dispensing wisdom. But you see, the wisdom dispensed is not a Middle Eastern sort of religion. It's a salvation by faith, which is another sort of nexus. It's put in a Palestinian milieu. Now, Islam is a Middle Eastern religion because it's based on law. It's based on law and how you should practice it. Christianity has gone the way of Paul. Paul is the character in his letters who's constantly arguing against the law in favor of faith. Now, at the time of Paul, I don't think there was a Jesus created in terms of the way we know him, because Paul doesn't know anything about him. See, if there was a Jesus created in the way we know him, he would be in Paul's letters. He would say, hey, you remember when Jesus was with the woman with the 20-year flow of blood, and then he touched her and her bleeding stopped? Or you remember when Jesus was with the crazies at the Gadara, and he took the spirits and they went into the herd of swine and ran off the mountaintop? Or you remember when Jesus was at the wedding in Cana, and he turned the water into wine? Everything that we love about Jesus, the miracle worker, Paul doesn't know a thing about, and he's living right then. So the stories hadn't been created yet in Paul's time. this very simply. That's the conclusion. Or you say, well, or else he's an ignoramus. Well, I don't think he's an ignoramus. So all of that which we love is later artistic, placing Jesus in a Palestinian view, but basically a Dionysus Osiris wonder worker. But Muhammad was not that. He's an historical figure, and Islam develops the way Judaism developed in the Middle East, according to law. And it's a religion of law as the background. So the conservators or perpetrators are legal specialists. So it totally is Judaism. Islam is Judaism, but Judaism cosmopolitanized, and Judaism that's forgotten itself. Because if you ask a Muslim, are you a Jew? He says, oh, I'm not a Jew. Oh, the Jews, you know, and they start spouting invective. And he's not even aware himself that Islam is just Judaism cosmopolitanized. It's the same structure, it's put together in the same way, it's basically using the same heroes. It's just a more cosmopolitan version of the same thing. And it's organized in the same way. But much more, since it's a newer thing, it's much more modern in the way it's put together. Didn't take 2,000 years to unfold or 1,000 years to unfold. It was created in the space of a generation or 2 or 3, of a century or 2, maybe 2 centuries. So it's much more clear in the way it's constructed. And so this, for instance, is very clear how the legal, if you ask Jewish legal people, they won't know how it's constructed. It'll be all a big hodgepodge. Whereas this is totally clear. They've got it all rationalized very, very carefully. Okay. So the Koran is the basic root of what there is. But there's not enough legal material in the Koran to make a full legal structure about all of life and a whole religion. So the next thing comes the Hadith, and that's the interesting subject in Islamic Arabic history. What are the Hadith? Now this is a little bit like Christianity in that the Hadith is good news. That's what it means. You know, newspapers in the Arab world are called al-Hadith. It means news. Well, who's it news about? Oh, it's news about the Prophet. It's news about the Prophet. So you could say the Gospels are just one big fat hadith, because the Gospels are what? The good news about Jesus Christ. So the hadith are the good news about Muhammad. But they're put together they didn't get into a story form the way the Gospels ultimately got into. Even though there's 4 versions, they got into a story form. And what happened was, over the century or 2 after the Prophet's death, after the rise of the Umayyad Caliphate, and then the Abbasid Caliphate, the Hadith began to swell and swell and swell and swell and swell. And there were all sorts of what are called traditions about the Prophet. So a good name for Hadith is a tradition. Now originally these traditions could be about anyone connected to early Islam. Didn't have to focus on the Prophet. Could have focused on Omar. Could have focused. There are hadith about Ali and stuff like that. But as time went on and the legal specialists got hold of it, they began more and more demand that the hadith be about the Prophet. Western scholars have studied this material very carefully, and this is where Western scholars and Eastern scholars disagree with each other. By the way, what's happening to our friends here? Where are they? They don't come anymore, because we're going to mark them down and tell them if they don't come to the class. I can't just take the midterm, get a good mark, and expect to do well in the class. So you must tell these young ladies here who obviously are offended by my lack of precision in Islam or whatever they don't like about the way I approach Islam, that they're expected to come. Whoever knows them should tell them that they're going to be marked down if they don't show up. Because we want them to know this material about the way Westerners see the study of Islam. And they don't come into the class just to study it from a Muslim perspective and get a decent grade. So please pass that word on to whoever you know who's not showing up because they got a decent grade on the midterm, that we're going to pay you back if you don't show up. I told you that at the beginning of the term. I'm telling you that now. I'm going to look at the attendance sheets, which reminds me, I don't have my bag with the attendance sheet. You want to rip me out a page, put a date on the top? Who's got a piece of paper? You got enough paper there to lend me one? Good. Put the date on there, pass it around. We're going to get really serious about this stuff from here on to the end. I promise you, if you're not on there, you'll start to lose a grade point. You'll go from an A to a B to a C. I'm going to reckon that in and tell everyone who's not showing up that that is the truth. Some of you know these people, and I want you to pass that word along, but I can't state it any stronger than that, because this is so important. Here's where Western scholars disagree with Muslims, and they should be the first ones to hear this. They're the ones who need to know this, so that they can decide which is the right approach, not just ignore what Western scholars say. Western scholars have studied this material extremely carefully. And it turned out that as the hadith got to be very widespread, collectors of hadith went all over the Muslim world, the Abbasid Empire, the Umayyad Empire in Spain, everywhere, to the far reaches of the empires, and collected these stories. And in the end, you know, just about everything in culture got put into the Prophet's mouth, even the Lord's Prayer from Christianity. Well, I'm sure the Prophet didn't utter the Lord's Prayer from Christianity. So it was clear that the hadith literature is often about as reliable as the gospel literature is. Some of it may be, some of it may not be. In fact, the parallel to the hadith is the gospels. What's the parallel to the Koran in Christianity? Paul's letters. Because Paul's letters are actual autobiographical account of what a person thinks. They're not in poetry. The Koran is an actual autobiographical account of the prophet's revelation from his own hand, it would appear, or that's the point that most people are supposed to accept. The Gospels are stories about Jesus, the same way that the Hadith are materials about the prophet. You see the parallel there? So the Gospels, and they're even called the good news about Jesus. The Gospels are the Hadith literature about Jesus. And the Koran are Paul's and other people's letters, but mostly Paul, because he wrote the most letters in the construction of Christianity. And that's true, that's the way it came first. The letters come first in Christianity. The Gospels come later. We don't know when the Gospels were finally put in the form we know them. Only that by the time Constantine holds his Nicaea conference, they're put in the final form in the 300s. So we don't know when the Gospels were written in the form we have. Some of the material might be early, some of it might be late. We have no idea. And no one's ever agreed on that either. There's no early version of the material that we can rely on, except something about John maybe in the 120s or something, but that's not very early. Yeah, get your name on there, because I'm gonna watch this very carefully.
The gospel narrator is
No, the gospel is a story, whereas the hadith are little traditions about the prophet. But I'll tell you about them in a moment. They're much smaller, you know, they go like, I heard from so-and-so, I heard from so-and-so, who saw Muhammad do such and such. Wipe his nose, or clean his hands, or pray in a certain way, or answer in some manner, or so on. And there's little short snippets about what people testify, but they grew so vast that you can be sure that it's not all about the prophet. And that's what Western Easterners don't like about Westerners, that Westerners treat the Hadith the same way they treat the Gospels. They criticize them. And they have basically a skeptical view of them. They have a skeptical view of the Hadith literature. So that angers Eastern. So when we get people like Said, what's his name, Edward Said, that they make a sort of, paper god out of now because he's against Western Orientalists. He's made Western Orientalists the whipping boy. That's just nonsense. Western Orientalists have just applied the the tools of Western redaction and text criticism to the Muslim materials, and Muslims don't like it. That doesn't mean Western Orientalism is wrong and Eastern Orientalism is right. It just means that Western Orientalists are trying to use their head, that's all. You say, well, Eastern Orientalists are not? You be the judge. I don't think that they are free within the context of the religions that they represent to operate in an objective, what we would call normal critical manner. Yeah, you see, they are, an Eastern Orientalist would be like someone in a school like a theological seminary, like someone up in Fuller Theological Seminary or something. Are those scholars at Fuller free scholars? No, they're not free, because they have to operate within the theological structure of that particular religious persuasion. So to criticize Western scholars, Orientals, it's just ridiculous. It's just pathetic. I've met some of the greatest Western Orientalists, and I don't consider myself one of them. My teacher at Columbia was he was so smart, it was beyond imaginable. He knew Islam inside and out. The Western Orientalists are really, totally absorbed in Islam. His name was Joseph Schacht, editor of the Encyclopedia of Islam. He was an incredibly brilliant, insightful person. He loved Muslims, loved Islam. To say negative things about him is ridiculous. Anyway, he wrote a book called The Origins of Mohammedan Jurisprudence, where he explained what the different schools were and how they, from the Hadith literature. And he's the one that identified Shafi as the key figure. I'll get to that in a moment. As it turns out, there are four great schools of Sunni jurisprudence. First of all, there's Abu Hanifa's school. Next, there's a person called Al-Malik. Then there's Shafi. Then there's Ibn Ahmed Ibn al-Hanbal. I think it's Ibn Hanbal. They're called the Hanbalis. So we have four groups here. We have the Hanafis after Abu Hanifa. We have the Malikis after Malik. We have the Shafis after al-Shafi. And we have the Hanbalis after Ibn Hanbal. Ibn Hanbal was the last one. He lived in Baghdad in about the 850s, in the middle of the height of the Abbasid Caliphate. Now, I studied Islamic law, so I think I'm pretty knowledgeable about this subject. Just because I studied it doesn't mean I am, but I think I am somewhat knowledgeable about it. Probably more than most people in the class here. And I think Western Orientalists are absolutely right in everything they've said. It's not because I like them, they just happen to, they've taught me an awful lot, and their work is wonderful. So these people go around gainsaying them by pigeonholing them and labeling them, and then you know, making negative comments about them, I think are absolutely doing a disservice to the study of this subject. And therefore, when I see these signs around the campus, let us celebrate Edward Said, I think that is ridiculous. You're celebrating the wrong person. It's like, it's a political statement you're making. You're not making an intellectual statement. Because he wrote a book laughing at Western Orientalists, which I think is a ridiculous book. And it's ridiculous to laugh at people who are very sincere and absolutely very, very talented and capable. Anyway, they work mainly on the Hadith literature. Shafi, Schacht, and then another scholar before him who they criticized because he was Jewish, so they don't like him. His name is Goldsinger, but he was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. His name was Ignaz Goldsinger. He's a Hungarian scholar. He wrote 2 volumes called Mohammedanische Studien, just essays on Koran and Sunnah. The guy was a total genius, and a few other scholars that are spun off from that time. I don't know any great Islamic scholars after this. These guys did all the groundwork, and I don't think there's been that much ever since of, you know, people who have been in their shadow. These were great, great scholars. So, what happened was that these hadith were collected, and Orthodox Sunni Islam recognized 6 collections. The 2 most famous of which one was called Al-Muslim, was one, and the other was Al-Bukhari. These were hadith collections. Sort of like the way the rabbis collect their Talmudic material. And they organized them, at least Bukhari did, in terms of legal subject matter, like, you know, what about washing your hands before you pray? What about women in their periods? What about subjects of that kind? So they were organized according to legal subject matter, like a legal handbook. And as I said, as these were collected, just about everything got in its mouth, into the Prophet's mouth, that was valuable in terms of Western civilization. Aside from the Lord's Prayer, there was one interesting hadith that said, anything good that has ever been said, you can take it as if I have said it. Well, that's a blanket statement if there ever was one. That just lets about everything in. Anything good that has ever been said, you can take it as if I have said it. Another one quotes him as saying, my community will never agree on an error. My community will never agree on an error. These are certainly after the fact. But that's a very important one, because that my community will never agree on an error solidifies the whole system. And it is the third root, consensus. And that is solidified, therefore, or concretized by this hadith attributed to the Prophet, my community will never agree on an error. Meaning that the ijma, the consensus of the community, is what determines what's true and false. Finally, as that was interpreted as time went on among Muslims themselves, it was the consensus of the scholars, the ulama, the learned people, the fuqaha, the ulama, the people learned in jurisprudence, who would be, their determination would be the one that would be recognized. And I said this took 2 or 3 centuries, from the 600s to the 8, even early 900s to develop. But by the 900s, things were more or less put in the shape we have them now. And that's the problem Muslim countries are facing. They're wrestling with a system that was put in place in the 900s. And this was called closing the gate of ijtihad. Throwing a lot of words at you here, sorry about that. Most of these words you'll find in the book by Gibb, Mohammedanism. It's a good little short handbook. You should read that book. It's easy reading. H.A.R. Gibb. He also writes a lot about Islamic literature. He was one of these scholars of the early years, dependent on Schock, Goldsheer, and these others. There was one Dutch scholar called Snooker Grunier, but I won't bother with him, who was very famous with these others. There are about 5 or 6 scholars from the late 19th century, early 20th century, who put this all together. When I read Schock's book, Origins of Mohammedan Jurisprudence, I blew my mind, because it taught me how to do tradition research. In fact, it helped me deal with Christianity. I didn't understand Christianity before I read this book about Islam, because I saw how traditions were put together, and I didn't understand previously how traditions were put together. His analysis was so trenchant on how the traditions came. And his analysis went something like this, and I don't think anyone's ever disproved it. In the early days, there were private specialists in the Umayyad period who started putting the legal practice of the Umayyad period into hadith form, into a hadith format. When we look at the literature, you'll see that the biographies of the Prophet are written in hadith format. And really these started to represent the practice of schools. One school in Syria, one school in Medina, and under the Umayyads, the Damascus, the Syrian area schools had priority. And then as the Abbasids took over, you got the Iraq schools. And they would more be, they started to take over, and the first Iraqi jurist was Abu Hanifa, the one I mentioned, in the 760s or so. He was at the time of the Abbasid takeover. He knew people like al-Mansur and people like that, the first Abbasid caliphs, and he was operating in the Iraq culture school. And he had a student called al-Shafi. Al-Shafi was the one who finally put the usul as we presently have it in place. And what happened was they started to put the hadith in, as I said, as we have it now, but the hadith represented the sort of legal opinions of different geographical locations. That's how I began to understand how the Gospels represented the legal or historical views of different geographical areas around the Mediterranean and so on of this person they were calling Jesus. In any case, as they put these together, Shafi made the final legal innovation. He said, I'm only going to accept a hadith, so by this time there were so many of them, it's, there were 6 collections. Ibn Hanbal had his own collection that wasn't even accepted. He was a later jurist around the 860s in Baghdad, Ibn Hanbal. Shafi was about the 800s. So Abu Hanifa and Malik was in Medina. He wasn't in the Iraqi school, he was in Medina. He and Abu Hanifa around the same time, the 760s, 770s. Shafi is around 800s, Ibn Hanbal is 850s. But by the time, once that was finished, the gate of ijtihad was closed. Those jurists were allowed to use their own power of opinion, which is the last thing here. Reasoning, analogy, qisas. Rai means reason. Qisas means, strictly speaking, analogy. And, taking one situation and through analogy, extending it to another. We do that all the time in legal practice. Often we call it precedent. What's the precedent for this? But it's a little wider. You take it and make it enough. So that's, but some of the schools didn't accept. This is good for you to know, because you say you're not in a school. My friend over here, you say you're not in a school, but you are. Everyone's in a school in Islamic jurisprudence. You're not allowed to combine schools in Islamic jurisprudence. You're either in one school or you're in another school. And the schools accept more or less of these things. But Shafi was the key figure in the construction of the usul as we have them according to Shah. And he said that, Shafi said, I will only accept a sunnah of the Prophet. So sunnah was not just sunnah, it became sunnah of the Prophet. Now what does sunnah mean? I told you before, Goldseer writes a very good essay or article on that. He said originally sunnah meant beaten path of the camel drivers, where the camels went in the desert. So actually it's the path the ancestors followed. It's the tradition of the ancestors. So any ancestor could be, you could have a sunnah about your great-grandfather, or a sunnah about your famous uncle or cousin or whatever. It's what the people usually followed from the ancient time, from primal history. But when Islam came in, it was the sunnah of the companions, the sunnah of the new Muslims, the sunnah of people who were important in the history of Islam. But with Shafi, he said it can only be a sunnah of the Prophet. I can't have a sunnah of Omar, I can't have a sunnah of Uthman, I can't have a sunnah of Ali. Now the Shiites say only sunnah, only hadith about Ali are acceptable. That's how they reject all the others. So they don't accept the Sunni collections of hadith at all. Only Ali hadith and sunnah are of any importance to them. So they're like totally in another world. Everything is about Ali. I don't know the name of their collections, but they have some collections in the name of Ali. But that's not what the what the Sunnis think. Now the Sunnis say all this is concretized by this ijma idea. Ijma is the basic building block. It's ijma that confirms the whole. My community will never agree on an error. The scholars, the consensus of the scholars will never be wrong. The agreement, the consensus of the community will never, as represented by the scholars, the ulama, will never be wrong. And that places them all in, in strong, solid foundation. So the community determines which of the hadith that are the basis of the sunnah, you follow me, are going to be accepted. So they had their own hadith criticism, the way we today do Bible criticism, do gospel criticism, Old Testament criticism. We scholars do the same thing here now. And but the problem is, this is again the difference between Western and Eastern Orientalists. Western Orientalists don't accept the Eastern way of evaluating the traditions.
Why?
I'll tell you why. That's what I'm getting to. I mean, there were literally hundreds of thousands of traditions. How did Eastern, why? It'll be clear why. How did Eastern hadith critics, if you want to call it that, evaluate these traditions? They had a whole system: strong, less strong, weak, spurious. I forget the names they used, but they have about 4 different categories. It's all in the Give book. You can see it in the Give book if you read the Give book. The different categories they use to evaluate the hadith as reliable or unreliable. How did they do it? Well, as it turned out, all these hadith had a chain of transmission associated with it, an isnad, which means chain. So the form of the hadith was, this is an answer to your why. You really need to ask why. I was going to get there. That's nice to jump ahead. It's a complex thing. This is just one little point. It's a whole understanding of how the system worked. These isnads would go something like this. I heard from so-and-so. This would be someone in the 9 or 800s, 8 or 9, who heard from so-and-so, who heard from so-and-so, who heard from Omar, who saw the Prophet put his handkerchief in his pocket. Or, I heard from so-and-so, heard from so-and-so, heard from so-and-so, who heard Omar say such and such, such and such thing. Or heard from so-and-so, heard from so-and-so, heard from so-and-so, who saw Ali stand up and sneeze, or whatever is in the given hadith. Whatever point they're making, whatever legal opinion is given, whatever. So they had chains of transmission with names of known people on them. And then they compiled huge biographical dictionaries to identify who all these people were in the history of Islam. And then they decided if they were good or bad Muslims. That is, if they were bad Muslims, like it was someone like Abu Sufyan, who's a bad Muslim, or some other folks that they didn't think was a reliable person, they rejected the hadith. Well, here's what Schacht and others say. Well, those are just the ones that probably shouldn't reject. Because if you were going to forge a hadith, which a lot of these are probably what we would now call forged, you wouldn't give it a bad isnad. In fact, if it had a bad isnad, in other words, if the transmission wasn't very, what you would call kosher, or didn't have the appearance of, didn't have what you would consider a good appearance, well, that would probably imply that it wasn't forged, because nobody was forging something would give it a bad isnad. You see, only the people who wanted the thing to look hunky-dory would give it the perfect isnad, so no one would reject it. It's like going to a courtroom and, giving your testimony there and making sure everything is like all cleaned up and nice and consistent. And then someone comes in who's inconsistent and says, oh, well, he's consistent. He isn't. No. If the guy comes in inconsistent, it means he hasn't prettied it up. So just what they were using to reject things may have been the thing that you shouldn't have rejected them on. And that's their criticism. That's their criticism. It's not based on the content or anything like that. It's just based on were the people who transmitted it, according to the biographical dictionaries, good Muslims. Well, Western scholars think that's an absurd form of criticism. It's not, it isn't criticism. It's like saying the Gospels, John, Mark, you see, it's very like the Gospels. This is the Gospel according to John. This is the Gospel according to Mark. Are John, Mark, Matthew, and Luke reliable witnesses? You see? And who knows if they're reliable witnesses? Oh, they're good Christians, that's it. They're reliable witnesses. And so whatever they say is okay. No, that's not the way, that's not sufficient to evaluate whether the Gospels are reliable or not. Just because they're put in the name of John or Mark or one of the other apostles or disciples that may not have even made them in the first place. So that's the weakness of Muslim Hadith criticism, and that's what our friend Mr. Said is calling Western Orientalism. And this is nonsense what they're saying, and it's deceptive to the average person. It's an attack on strong intellectual standards is what it is, and it's very, I mean, I can't attack it myself enough because I've seen Western Orientalists, and they're the most impressive, serious-minded people in any subject I've ever had the pleasure of being part of. And I just resent it personally, and so does my colleague who trained under Western Orientalists up in McGill University. She's did French, mostly French Orientalists, but all of them are terribly serious and painstakingly careful people. Nothing like the field I'm in now, Dead Sea Scroll studies and Christian sort of text criticism and so on, nothing like that. The Islamic thing was always done on the highest level by Western scholars. So, I mean, I just object to this silly labeling them Orientalists and then throwing their work away. That's just ridiculous. So anyway, you'll have to decide that for yourself. I've already told you where I stand on that issue. I think that they are right to question these things. I don't think that the Hadith tell you anything particularly about the Prophet or not. And they may or they may not, but it needs a different kind of evaluation. Anyway, that being said, the practice and opinion of the legal schools, according to Schock, got into the Hadith. So ultimately, out of all this, 4 legal schools emerged, as I told you. The school in Iraq were called the Hanafis after the scholar Abu Hanifa around 760 or 770 or something like that. Malik is around 760, he's in Medina. Hanbal is in Baghdad, he's much more conservative, he's around 850. Shafi is about 800 and he ends up in Egypt, even though he started out in Iran. These people all wrote legal textbooks, and the legal textbook that they wrote became the focus of the different schools. Now, the closing of the gate of Ijtihad says that only these great legal scholars have a right to exercise their opinion. Once it was put in the final form that they arrived at, no one after that had the right to exercise his or her opinion. So Islamic law in all these 4 areas became totally frozen, like a fossil, and didn't change for 1,000 years. And just became concretized and still is there. It's like fundamentalist Christianity or Judaism, which is why Islam cannot come out of the Middle Ages. You can't upgrade women's rights. You can't do anything because of this frozen situation. And they want to open the door of Ijtihad from the 19th century to the 20th century. And now there's a reaction. The Bin Laden lunatic fringe people are now threatening everyone, and they're going back to the more conservative position. So who knows what the next century will bring. That's what the struggle in Iraq is all about, which is why I think the struggle in Iraq is good, and that the threateners, the bully boys, the people who want to frighten people, cow people into conformity should be defeated, even if it takes a Western army to help the people do it. because that's the only way you're going to get an opening of the gate of Ijtihad and a modernization. And the people fighting that battle know that that's the case, and therefore they don't want the Western armies in there. They don't want the gate of Ijtihad to come open. They don't want the societies to change. They don't want them to be modernized. I mean, I can put the whole struggle in a nutshell for you. The newspapers can't do it, but it's very simple, and I've just given it to you in a nutshell. This is what it's all about. The Bin Laden and all the other types don't want the thing to unfreeze. They want to go back to the classical period. They want to go back to medieval Islam. You started to get what was called Islamic modernism at the end of the 1800s, into the early 1900s in Egypt and other countries. And now they want to turn back that clock. And they do it through brute force, through threatening people, through all kinds of horrible sort of threats, even cutting people's throats and stuff like that. And if you're there, you're not going to speak up, I can assure you. If you're living in these countries where you can have your throat cut or your wife can be raped or something like that, you're not going to speak up. Unless you're an extremely brave man. They had some interviews about what happened to women in Egypt who were trying to speak, and they had that on CNN just last night. I listened to it. It was horrible to hear their testimony, how they were beat up and brutalized on the streets in Egypt, and that's a modern Islamic country. It's a kind of frightening struggle, and you need a referee there, unfortunately. So, well, who makes you the referee? I think the Americans did a pretty good job without the people criticizing them in Germany and Japan, and I think the Germans and Japanese were the first people to admit it. I think the Americans are doing and have done a good job in Yugoslavia and Kosovo and Bosnia. You know, Americans aren't perfect, but they try to do something decent occasionally. And if they had done something in Africa, maybe a lot of slaughter there wouldn't have gone on. They probably shouldn't have run away from Mogadishu and places like that. Maybe they should be in the Sudan stopping that, you know, massacring and raping and every other horrendous thing, burning people in fires, you know, little children, throwing them in bonfires. I mean, it's just disgusting. I just read an article in the paper today about you can rape any woman as long as she's dark. I mean, that's how they determine, well, you're dark, I can rape you. You know, you need a referee. You should protect the weak. Defiance of the strong, protection of the weak. Wasn't that what Marua was all about? We studied in the beginning of the class. I think you need to protect the people who are being brutalized and threatened. And maybe you shouldn't brutalize them. Shouldn't have Abu Ghraib and stuff like that. Anyway, this is the situation we face in Islamic law today. So, here's how the schools run. The Maliki school went from Medina, spread across North Africa with the Muslim armies, got to Spain, got to Morocco, and basically every Arab country or area in North Africa and West Africa, including Mali and Nigeria, are all Maliki. They went with the Muslim armies across North Africa. Iraq and eastwards became Hanafi. That's why I know that he's a Hanafi, even though he doesn't know it. Because the Turks, particularly out in Central Asia, were converted from Iraq into Hanafi school of Islamic law. And when they came back in the Seljuk period and the Ottoman period, they brought the Hanafi rite back in with them. So you got a kind of thing that the Ottoman Empire was Hanafi, and the Mughal Empire too in India would be Hanafi. But in India was created a kind of Anglo-Mohammedan law too, but it was based on the Hanafi school. They didn't know anything about Shafis, Malikis, Hanbalis in India at all. Only Hanafis out that way. But in Iraq proper, Shafiism made inroads, and in Egypt. So it turns out that the upper class tends to be Hanafi, but the masses tend to be Shafi. In Iraq, I'm talking about Sunni areas. In Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, Egypt, those places tend to be mixed, but mostly the average person is Shafi. The Ottoman upper class is Hanafi. And then finally, Hanbalis. They retreated as the most conservative group into what we now call Saudi Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula proper. The Arabian Peninsula is Hanbali, the most conservative group, but even Hanbali with a vengeance, since they've gone even further. Hanbali jurist called Abdul ibn Wahhab of more recent times gives you a Wahhabi version of Hanbalism. And now we speak about the Saudis as being Wahhabis. That's just the name of the jurist, Abdul ibn Wahhab. But they're originally Hanbalis, and more extreme even than that, Wahhabis. But what's the difference between the four schools? Well, the most liberal of the four schools are the Hanafis. This is really their basic structure here. They recognize all these things, including qisas. Where the differences come is how much qisas or ra'i, individual opinion, are you going to allow? The Malikis, less. The Shafis say none at all, only these three things: Koran, Hadith, Ijma. And the Hanbalis say no Ijma, just these, Koran and Hadith. Those are the roots, and they grow more and more conservative as we go down the line. So the Hanbalis are the most conservative. Everything has to be based on Koran and Sunnah. Shafis, Sunnah, yes. Ijma, yes, but only a Sunnah of the Prophet. Only a Sunnah that goes back to the Prophet. Can't be a Sunnah that goes back to Khalid ibn al-Walid or something. It has to be. So you see, what Shak and the others say, once Shafi did that, said he would only accept a Sunnah of the Prophet, everyone started to manufacture Sunnahs in the name of the Prophet. Because that's the only thing that they would, once he raised the Prophet had to be the Prophet, then of course anyone writing a legal tradition after that would put it in the name of the Prophet. And that's why this is a very complex study. You see how complex it is, and it's not sufficient to look at the isnads, because the most unreliable ones would probably have the best isnads. That doesn't mean there aren't some reliable ones with an isnad, decent isnad. But once the Prophet became raised, then all the new ones after that were put in the name of the Prophet. What about the old ones that hadn't been put in the name of the Prophet? Take a vast study. I'm not going to do it, frankly, because frankly, it's too much for me. But the Muslims don't undertake it with the proper objectivity that we're speaking about usually. So I'm not sure they can undertake it either. Actually, a Western scholar, maybe a Western Muslim scholar, would have to look into this, go beyond where Schacht and these others went. But it's a vast undertaking to do. But I must say, Schacht, if you think I'm nuts, Schacht taught me everything I know about how to do tradition research, which helped me with the Gospels. I just applied it to the Gospels because it was a really powerful tool that he showed me how to exercise such consideration of things. Well, that's all I have to say about Islamic law. Have I confused you guys thoroughly? It's quite a subject. It's a really amazing subject. Anyway, when all is said and done, Islamic law then is known as Sharia. The final version of all this comes to be known as Sharia, which means street, way. If you're in an Arab Islamic city, you go down a street and it'll say Sharia Ibn Khaldun Street, Sharia Robert Eisenman Street. Another than after me, don't worry about that. Sharia Yasser Arafat, Yasser Arafat Street, and so on. Sharia Saddam Hussein Street, and so on and so forth. So actually, nowadays it's just street, but the grand name is the way, and it's like Jewish halakha, which also means the way. Halakha means the going, and that's what Jews, and Jews also sought legal traditions, which they called halakhot. So the whole system of the two are parallel. The Islamic thing, because the vaster world was much vaster, and therefore it took a lot more effort to collect everything. but it was also done in a much shorter period of time. But the parallels with Judaism are very strong, and even in the idea of hadith literature, it's very, very strong. So it's a religion based on law. That's why jurists play such an important role. Now, what about theology? Well, theology sort of followed something of the same tack. So, in theology, again, most of this developed under the Abbasids in Baghdad in the 800s and 900s. For a while, you had a lot of free thinkers coming in, influenced by the translation of Greek manuscripts. And so, you had a lot of philosophical texts being written as well as theological texts. But as time went on, there was a reaction to this. And the theologians of the 900s in Baghdad, particularly led by a person called Al-Ashari, whose form of theology finally won out, reacted against a lot of this free thinking that was coming in the 800s, the same as in the legal sphere. So in the 900s, what the free thinking, philosophical analyzing of things. There was a group called the Mu'tazilites. I don't want to bore you with those names, but there were all these theological movements like the Harijis and so on and so forth in the 700s. The great philosophers, for instance, Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, and Ibn Rushd. Al-Kindi would be again 700s, Al-Farabi 900s, Ibn Sina 1000s, Ibn Rushd, I think maybe 1100 or 1200. These are people who actually took Aristotelian thought and applied it to Islam. The way Aquinas took Aristotelian thought and applied it to Christianity in the Middle Ages. But you see, Aquinas is dependent on these people. So you got the first translations then would give rise to people like Al-Kindi. Now, these people are known in the Western world. So, for instance, Ibn Sina is known to the Western theologians as Avicenna, and Ibn Rushd is known as Averroes. And Ibn Rushd was considered, oh my God, this was like almost the Antichrist. He was so rational. These people were translated through Hebrew into Latin in Spain. That's where they get their names, Abi, for Ibn. Ibn goes into Abi, which is the Hebrew word for father. I don't know why that word was used. But anyway, Ibn Sina, which is a Persian thinker, becomes Avicenna. Ibn Rushd, which is a Spanish Muslim thinker, becomes Averroes. And if you read Dante, Dante has these people in his hell, but in a high level of hell, not a low level of hell. They're almost Christian for Dante. They're so enlightened and inspired. But that shows that Dante in the late 1200s, early 1300s, already knows about these people that have already made their way into the West. And that really does trigger humanistic revival in Italy in the 1300s, which triggers the Renaissance in the 14 and 1500s. So it's the contact with Islamic culture through these translation agencies that triggers the humanistic revival in Europe and scholastic synthesis in Europe, and then on to the Renaissance. So where the Muslims stopped, the Europeans picked up. Now, let me tell you two things about the stopping. We talked about the closing of the gate of ijtihad. No more individual reasoning in jurisprudence, therefore no more new schools. Only Abu Hanifa, Malik, people like that could use their own reason. You, the average practitioner, had to just follow through what they said through precedent, but nothing more. That's what ijtihad means, individual analysis or individual use of your own brain. And that was considered closed after about 950 or so. Same in theology. All these things about was there a creator, what was the creation like, what was existence like, all these things were shut down by Al-Ashari in the 900s as the Abbasid Empire slipped into decay. And his school of theology was called, I love the name of it, the Bila Kaifa School. The Bila Kaifa School. Why was it called the Bila Kaifa School? Oh, you Arabic speakers in the room might know. Bila Kaifa means without, with no. Bila means with no. Without Kaifa, how or why. Without asking how or why. That's it. No how or why. You take it the way it's given you, and that's it. Period. And that's been the Islamic world since the 900s, 1000s until the coming of Napoleon and the collision with the West. Bila Kaifa was on top of all new theology. There were going to be no more innovations, no more changes. Everything was going to be frozen. Now, the same thing happened in this philosophical thought. Ibn Rushd was very modern. He subjected everything to analysis, and he was in Spain in the golden age of Spain. But another thinker, more in the Sufi line, came along, and his name was Al-Ghazali. And Al-Ghazali had originally been brought up in free thinking, philosophers and everything, and finally he retreated into the world of Islamic mysticism, which is what we will study towards the end of this course, Sufism, which is a name for Islamic mysticism, which is mystical practice, exhilaration, enlightenment, things like that. And this was around the 1000s, Al-Ghazali. I think I have a text in your collection from Al-Ghazali. And Al-Ghazali wrote a book called Takhafut. I don't know if I've got this right. Something like that, anyway. I don't know how you want to translate. Anyway, the Takhafut of the philosophers. Sorry. The Takhafut of the philosophers. Takhafut in Arabic is incoherence. The incoherence of the philosophers. And that was in the 1000s. Well, in the 1200s, Ibn Rushd answered him in Spain. And Ibn Rushd answered, and his name of his book was Takhafut Takhafut. The incoherence of the incoherence. Now, he wrote a book attacking Al-Ghazali called The Incoherence of the Incoherence. And basically, he was in the realm of modern, scientific, Aristotelian sort of thought, but pushed further, extremely reasonable, very intelligent, and quite an amazing figure. And now it's his work and others that were translated into European languages, as I said, in Spain in the 1200s, and moved into Europe and caused a lot of free thinking in the 12 and 1300s in Europe. So that Avicenna and Averroes, particularly Averroes, became like almost names of high respect, worshipped, godlike. They were so influential. People ask me, how come the West went one way and the East went another? It's not, you can't always put everything in a capsule, but part of it has to do with that the East followed Al-Ghazali, al-Ashari, and closing the gate of ijtihad. And therefore everything was shut down and became frozen from around 1000, 900 to 1000 onward. No new thought was recognized. No new individual effort was recognized, was encouraged. Everything had already been decided. And the West, which had been suffering in the Dark Ages and in intellectual morass nowhere, picked up people like Averroes and went the way of Averroes. And whereas Averroes was rejected by the East, he was embraced by the West. And everything we've seen that's happened in the West since, from the 1300s onwards, has been a result of the opening up of intellectual thinking, of the Renaissance, of the Enlightenment, and so on and so forth. And all that's happened since was that the West went the other way, and therefore the West makes jet planes. The West, unfortunately, if you don't like them, makes atom bombs. The West makes transistors, computer chips, computers, and so on. Japan included now as a Western country, as far as it took the West on. So the Muslims say, when will we be great again? Oh, well, you can only be great again when you go the way of the West and go beyond it. You can't go back to the Middle Ages to become great. You can go back to the Middle Ages, yeah, but then you will just go back to a primitive, frozen world. That's fine. That's the world you want to live in. That's the answer. That's the question Muslims today have to answer. I don't think they have an answer, and I think they are totally confused and are being blown around by emotions. Like in France, the young Islamic kids burning up cars and things like that. Okay, it's good, feel good for the moment, but it's not going to solve your problem. In fact, it's just going to make it worse. What is the problem? You can't just go and buy, as they used to do in the 70s, television sets in the West. You can't just go and buy jet planes in the West. You can't just go and buy computers or atom bombs in the West. You have to actually have the facilities to create these things yourself and go beyond them. You have to follow Ibn Rushd with a vengeance. I would tell that to any Muslim. They don't listen to me, but that's what I would tell them. So when did Islam go astray? I think Islam was going extremely well in the 700s, 800s, and 900s. And then this reaction set in. Maybe the political situation changed. I don't know what caused it. The collapse of the Abbasid Empire and so on, things like that. And things turned in on themselves. And we got a little bit, paranoid and schizophrenic against outside forces. And that's the Islam we see today. To some extent. I mean, people are trying to do something about it.
Oh shit, sorry guys.
Well, I wouldn't mind if he wouldn't curse, but now we got him on camera cursing. That's for the ages here. So what are you, any opinions? You want to give me questions about this now? We got about 5 more minutes to just throw this around a bit. I finished what I want to say about this. Yeah.
Mr. Hira, how did the thing of...
Sharia.
My bad.
Oh, no, say it. Yeah, go on, say it. Sharia. Say it with me. Sharia. Yeah.
Sharia. How did the whole thing of, I don't know, maybe to certain parts of groups in Africa, maybe female genital?
That's not in Sharia. That's customary. That's customary. Not just Africa. A large parts of the Muslim world, Arab world, do female genitalia circumcision. It's not just the Arab. I don't know how they justify that. It's not in the Sharia. No, it's not in the Sharia. Not to my knowledge. It's again customary behavior.
Nothing in the jihad or something?
It got nothing to do with Islam.
It shouldn't have. Islam tolerates it, but
Yeah.
it shouldn't have anything to do with Islam. It's not in the Hadith and it's not in the Sharia. It's customary. I don't know. It's insanity. That's all I can say. It's total insanity.
It's not a science. It's so weird.
Yeah.
It's all based on tradition and how they
Yeah,
lived
right.
before it. Got
Right.
nothing to do with it.
It could be connected to Islam in the sense that Islam wanted women to be in a inferior cultural status and to be held under control in some way, and they thought that these things encourage sexuality, so that by removing the sexual impetus like this to some extent does, because it does take away some of the sexual arousing paraphernalia that are part of the woman's, what do you want to call it, physiology, that they thought they would be able to control and make women less evil, all in quotes, as they say. So it may not be totally traditional. You'd have to see. Well, I don't think tribes in Africa that are not under Islam do it. For instance, I don't think, for instance, groups in the Congo or places like that, where traditional culture is practiced. It's more like in a Somalia, or it's done.
Tribes in Kenya.
Yeah, but they're Muslim oriented, some of them there too. I don't know. The Christian tribes don't do it in Kenya. No, I don't think they do. See, the Somalia goes down into northern Kenya. Anyway, it's a good question, but it's not connected to Sharia or Islamic law. But Islamic law does protect it. Don't ask me how or why. That's a good thing to look into. I don't have the answer. Any case, you see, Muslims used to come to, they don't anymore. How can we be like you? When will we defeat the West? We want to defeat the West. Okay, when you go the way of Ibn Rushd and stop trying to say Orientalists are mad and bad and so on, when you want to use your intellect in a way that will upgrade Islam and bring it in tune with the 21st century and so on, you will not only equal, you can outpace the West. But as long as you insist on, holding on to these frozen situations that you have created, at a time when you created them, they were very forward and they were very advanced and very impressive. But when you froze them in place, you stopped developing in theology, in philosophy, in law, and all these other areas. And therefore, a dark age descended on Islam, just like it did on Christianity. But the dark age in Islam went from around 1100 to 1800, 1900. Anyway, that's where we are at the moment. Next time we'll do pre-Islamic Arab poetry. Bring your blue books. We will get to them now.